Welcome to a special edition of Precog time with the artist Carlos Franco. This is Precog number 37 as we approach 2 years of COVID life. And Carlos is an analog and digital artist who makes a lot of different work and has been in Precog magazine issue number 5, both the magazine and the virtual Dream Center Bubble Orchestra experience, and currently has a residency and studio at the International Curatorial and Studio Program in New York. And so we wanted to thank you for joining us and start out asking you how your 2022 has been.
Hopeful, hoping for the best right now, but everything good. I don't know. It's been an interesting transition, and happiness will be the right word, and kind of like wariness to not get my hopes that much up. So yeah, I would say good. Just getting ramped up right now.
And Carlos, I think it would be good if you could just introduce a little bit about yourself, about your background, because you're not coming from a traditional art background. Would you say that?
I guess no. I guess yes and no. I did study philosophy and art for my undergrad. Then I went to San Francisco. I did a master's in new genres, but I guess yes and no. I don't know. I think it's because I work all over the place, but yeah, usually my work is kind of depending on the mood and depending on what I'm reading or the medium, I usually just go and dab really deep into something and may seem a little bit out of the context of more traditional commitment to a thing, one thing or the other. But yeah, I don't know. It's pretty, I would say non-traditional, but it's still within the framework, annoyingly so, in the sense of my past history and education.
Okay. And then I guess we could start talking about the environment that you made for Bubble Orchestra. But was an issue that we made, and we also collaborated with the Virtual Dream Center. And for the people that don't know, we have a printed magazine, and then we had a virtual world we invited all the artists to also contribute to that. And Carlos made this environment that was populated by Pepe the Frog. And it was kind of like this thing where anywhere in the game, you could move around and this frog just keeps popping up. And I was wondering, is that the first time you created a virtual space that was kind of interactive?
I developed some games before, basically 2D. And that was my first time completely committed, I guess, to a certain degree to using Unity 3D and whatnot. It really came from, I was working with the video, a video that I presented at Vika and at ICP last year. And then you guys had invited me, and I was working on this map also for this video, which we may see later in the programming. And then once I had that invitation, I was like, you know what would make sense, this parallel to all this other work that I was doing, this space in which I make the connection between Pepe the Frog and the Coqui Frog. The Coqui Frog is a frog endemic to Puerto Rico, and every time during the night, if you're Puerto Rican, you know what this song is, Coqui, Coqui, Coqui. And I was trying to just draw nice parallels between a weird racist frog that's being co-opted by the American alt-right and this kind of extreme nationalism, and another frog which is in the other side of the spectrum, a nationalist symbol, which is considered actually an invasive species in the Western United States and Hawaii, and kind of open up that space of conversation about, there's a weird irony about the specificity of frogs and there being a supposedly racist frog in the internet, and then this other kind of biological ecosystem. And I wanted to kind of create a space a semiotical space to, or a VR space in this case, to contrast those two stuff, I guess. Yes.
Okay.
Really, really long answer.
And then I guess maybe what the question is also like a lot of your work references technology and how you're interacting with technology on an everyday basis. How, like, one of the questions that I had was like, how are you collecting all the materials that you work with?
Well, I don't have an agenda on it. Like, really, it was like a one moment I was just doing, like, for example, the background that you see in my image was like an old collage that I made on my iPhone. And at one moment I was just traveling a lot, and I had just started doing a lot of work on my iPhone, especially like in 2013, when that became actually a viable thing. And it was like work that I actually just did, kind of like playing around. There was like not a conceptual agenda. There wasn't like an ideological motive. It was just like, oh, I'm gonna work in my iPhone while I'm about to go to sleep, or I'm commuting, and so on. So it was kind of like me just having fun. And then as the years went by, I started choosing for certain projects kind of like more specific approaches to that. So for example, the work that you've seen here as a moving target was just me. I was like traveling, I guess, through Spain and France, and I was just interested in how the targets are, or like the ads will follow me over different languages, and like creating kind of like specific motifs. And I was just like basically started saving all of these targeted ads that were thrown at me, and I just found it interesting to make a kind of like funny self-portrait out of that. Kind of like, okay, this is like how this third party company that sell advertisement to like, for like basically channel the Google data sets thing my profile is, which is kind of funny because it overlaps with the whole project of Pepe the Frog and all of the cryptocurrency stuff, which that project also touches upon. So sometimes, again, just to try to make it short, sometimes I do have like a specific conceptual angles, but a lot of the times it's just me. Oh, this is interesting. I'm gonna put it in my ever-growing folders, and then maybe use it in the future for something, and just like create like weird, eclectic, flat surfaces, to not call it collage.
One of the things, especially hearing you talk about it now, which is interesting, in relationship between this piece as a moving target and the Pepe the Frog piece for Precog, and that you were working on the video for ISCP, is that like in the Pepe video, like as Flo was describing earlier, wherever you go, you're confronted with more frogs, right? And that seems to map really clearly onto this like moving target, the targeted ad scenario, where like even if the content of the ad changes, the function of the targeted ad as this kind of this way that the algorithm is trying to turn you into a consumer is something which follows you regardless of geography. And it makes me think about like one of the questions that Flo and I were talking about the other night was the way that you use and disrupt narrative in your videos. Like it seems as though, you know, in some ways, like the narrative of capitalism is always just like create commodity desire and then have someone buy it, right? Or create people who are dependent on this kind of desirous relationship to the, you know, the fetish object. But that like in many of your videos, and we'll show some clips soon, you kind of like use the affects of these relationships, like usually in sound, to cue up what kind of thing is about to happen, like the ding, which makes you want a box, or like a sound which indicates a computer is starting, or these sort of like this technological soundtrack, or this advertising soundtrack that we already know exactly how it links into the things that we might be wanting, or the kinds of objects that might be being sold to us. And that you end up deploying these over and over again so that they become tropes, right? Like we're able to see those sounds as vessels or containers or predictors of a certain kind of consumerized relationship in a way that feels very similar to the way that you're talking about the ads as this kind of template, or the frog as this inescapable environment. And so I know that was a long question in framing, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to narrative and these kinds of tropes, and how you think about these gestures as they signal economy, as they prefigure a relationship to content, etc.
Really long question. Let me see where I grabbed that. My relationship to narrative is kind of interesting because something that I've been thinking about in relation to that as I make video work, which obviously forces you to have a linear track. It's kind of like trying to make video work that's non-linear, or at least it grabs from multiple sources at the same time, and it's almost like always in transition. So it's like a weird challenging of like, what is the linearity is an interesting thing, and we've been dealing with it with such a long time, and obviously filmmaking disrupted that and some contemporary literature. And I always, when I go into my video work, I always try to approach it from that kind of space of like, how do I make something that depends on a sequence of events seem non-linear, or kind of like, what is when we open up a web page we have, or for example, if you go to Facebook, I don't know, I don't use Facebook anymore these days, but you usually have content, a post, you have an ad on the right, you have your uncle screaming about something in some other region down there, and you keep scrolling, and there are like all of this stimuli and different history and different sources happening at the same time, kind of like affecting your brain in one way or another, and kind of like fragmenting your attention spans in some other cases. So in a lot of senses, I try to tap into that, especially with the more recent work, which like as you said, we may see later, and kind of like addressing this kind of new ecosystems, I guess. I hesitate these days calling it ecosystems. I used to do it way more. But then also our relationship and how we're shifting our own biological bodies and like all of this wet hardware and software to adapt to these new spaces. And obviously that goes into the conversation of like the implications of that being politics, being, I don't know, like some kind of ethics in design, which points toward like the whole idea of like the cling sound, which sounds like really pleasurous, and it's almost like this Pavlov effect. So yeah, there's a lot of questions that I try to throw in there in conversations, and then at the same time, kind of like the moment that I kind of like do a statement, I try to turn the statement to something else and play around with this kind of trope of like, attention, what is it? What am I trying to ask? Nothing. Oh yeah. So in really confounded relationship to narrative. Sometimes I wish I could sit down and write a nice script and be like, yes, I want to make a 2-hour film and it's just about this story about this dog. But I find it completely impossible, and I slowly start seeing multiple things happening, and yeah. So I don't know if I would even call it narrative, although I guess it is. Yes.
I can show a clip. I think this seems like a good moment. What do you think?
Yeah.
All right.
You think crypto blockchain has the potential to change that? Yeah, I mean, this is one area where live. Puta, te compramos hasta aquí, te las quemamos todas, soldado. Dímelo, Lorito. Cryptocurrency, blockchain, electronic democracy dreamed. This is a rescue mission. All this craziness was happening. This is the
I'm just gonna turn the sound down in case you wanted to talk
So yeah.
as we keep looking at images. But
So yeah, like I say for this specific piece, at one moment I just started seeing like some interesting interconnectedness between like three media spaces, I guess, or three media nodes, which was like Pepe the Frog, Brock Pierce, and Pepe the Frog, obviously like the frog co-opted by the alt-right. In the United States, Brock Pierce, this guy that's trying to create a crypto utopia in Puerto Rico by buying a lot of cheap land because land became really cheap after Hurricane Maria because a lot of people from my generation just started leaving, many millennials, some people like young people in the workforce. And then the coquille frog, which is a frog endemic to Puerto Rico, as I already said. So I just started like how these things, weirdly enough, seeing how these things fit to each other in a really non-linear way, as we were talking about this kind of narrative. For example, at one moment, Brock Pierce, so Brock Pierce became a cryptocurrency millionaire by playing World of Warcraft. At one moment, he created a company in China to hire World of Warcraft players so they would mine rare minerals and weapons and then sell them to Western players. Any moment, fast forward to the story, at one moment, Steve Bannon became CEO of that company in China. And I just started seeing this weird connection between kind of like, and then that's where Steve Bannon learned how to kind of like exploit like gaming culture and this idea of like, oh, what does it mean to be in a video game or like 4chan and exploit like this kind of like male anger or like how to use meme, hashtag Breitbart. And like you started seeing like this kind of like interesting connections like they're really like 21st century and how they overlap obviously with like what we more consider, I guess, more traditional ecosystems, meaning like biologists being like race politics in the United States, or even the needs of the Puerto Rican population emigrating into the United States, and that triggering obviously us being Latinos, kind of like triggering, I imagine, some wave of resentment in certain part of the population of the United States, almost like the frogs. So it was like just me kind of grabbing all of that and then deciding on these three nodes and just getting all this media from these three nodes as I just like did my research and I created like, as I said, the map, the triptych that I published with Precog magazine, this video, and I guess the third piece would be like the Pepe the Frog interactive space, which was like Pepe the Frog doing like the cookie sound and trying to open up these kind of like spaces of conversation, I guess. Sí, señor. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot that I could say to this, but then I'm also kind of like, I always try not to be too linear and dissect the word and work and kill it, and more like trying to allow some kind of agency for people to make some sense out of it, especially since the work itself kind of like challenges that kind of like linear interpretation, to be completely honest, in a lot of senses.
I have a question. So if there's this like utopia, this Bitcoin utopia that's kind of being built right now in Puerto Rico, how is that changing the physical landscape? Do you like, have you seen it like be like, are new buildings being built? Is there a new culture?
Yeah, for example, if you go at the end of the video and you put the part where Brock Pierce is talking, funnily enough, he also ran for president in 2020. Like I'm just dropping that weird fact about like the weird interconnectedness of all of this, president of the United States, obviously. How it's changing the landscape. It's like they're just buying a lot of cheap real estate. And for example, a lot of people right now, and it's becoming a huge issue. And like, it's funny that I started this work at 2018 and I showed it at the beginning of 2020. And again, like at ICP in 2020, later in 2020. And now it's becoming again a thing because a lot of expats are moving to Puerto Rico because of this law called, I guess it was called the 2022, and now it's called the Law 60, or I don't know how you call it in English, but basically a tax exemption for certain kind of income. So you have a lot of people that are affluent, like Logan Paul, like the YouTuber. He's moving to Puerto Rico. He bought a mansion in Puerto Rico, and like there's all these people that are buying this beachfront kind of like spaces and kind of like privatizing it or trying to turn it into Airbnb, and basically displacing a lot of people that obviously don't have money to pay X amount. Like, you know, it's kind of like I'm basically explaining gentrification for you in a really obvious way. For example, Brock Pierce bought like a building that's like in the center of Old San Juan, and then that inspired a lot of other North American investors to start buying buildings and sell them out, like or rent them out as Airbnb at a profit, which is kind of like weird because even me, I was last year over there, and then I was just renting from this guy that was like basically he was living in Boston and running his Airbnb through in Old San Juan, which is kind of the capital of Puerto Rico, from Boston. And I don't know if he ever visits like the island or the one, but it's like this weird kind of like, again, this kind of new technologies kind of like impacting and kind of like creating tension with the local population and almost like aggravating the need for example, displacement of people that can't afford like housing in Puerto Rico right now because of this same stuff. So yeah, it's like a really complicated conversation. Like there's a YouTuber, Bianca Gabrao, that I can't believe I'm plugging over here. Let me see if I find her and I put it on the chat if anyone wants to inform themselves more about what's going on. Bianca, okay, Bianca Graulao. And she's doing like great independent reporting over there, and I guess I should if anyone wants to inform themselves more on the issue. But it's like a lot of like just like gentrification and displacement and kind of aggravating the situation that happened after the hurricane, which is almost like a long-lasting effect with a lot of branching implications. And again, it's kind of like a complicated situation. Yeah.
And like, I'm wondering, are they also like building like apocalyptic like bunkers or something? Because I'm like, what if there's another hurricane? What are you gonna do? Like, is that really like a good investment? Or
well, I think they tried for a couple. They tried changing the electrical system to turn it more adaptable to the island, but then that backfired because like, you know, the government of Puerto Rico is like a tricky conversation on how much the island depends itself on federal funding and certain kind of contracts. So yeah, like the most apocalyptic thing is recently I saw that Brock Pierce opened up a crypto NFT art gallery in Old San Juan. That was like probably the most cringe thing that I've seen apocalyptic. I was like, no. And then I saw what's the name of the De Blasio hanging over there. And it's like this really weird connection right now with Eric Adams, De Blasio, and all of these people just traveling also and getting funding from Brock Pierce. Like a weird kind of like, again, only in the 21st century, and this weird political situation and kind of like feedback loop generating over there between digital cultures, economies, local populations, and so on. I could really expand on the video, but I got tired of working on that video because I edited on my MacBook Pro, and basically it kept crashing after a while because it was like too much stuff happening. So I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna update this again. It's like a little bit too much. Gotta move on.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the videos that you make and the sculptures or the installations that you create, and how you, because you often like or you'll sometimes like project videos in like very particular places on walls or ceilings, and then you also make objects sometimes in relationship to the video work as well. So how are you thinking about objects, and how do they relate to the video works that you're making?
In the Wayback Machine, I used to be more excited about like doing like mixed installations with sculpture. And the one usually depends on the project itself. Like for example, this one, season 1, episode 2 and 3 was presented at Buffalo Theater Contemporary Art when the pandemic started that January. And I presented it with like the video that you guys saw, which I guess it close bracket is the name. That video doesn't have a name. And I was just wanted to contrast this idea of like a deconstructed landscape. This is basically for people, most of you probably haven't seen it, so like obviously a clepsydra. So water moves from one tank to another for the duration of an hour, and basically creating like different scenes. So right now the lights are turned on in this video, in this photo. When the water's moving to the other tank, the horizontal one, basically the water's turned off and it makes the sound of water dropping on top of tormenteras, storm, I don't know how you call them, maybe somebody knows. When I was looking for them over here, I got the name and then I totally forgot. But basically, it's the lights turn off and it just turns into this kind of like dark soundscape. And it just reminds me, it's almost like being in Puerto Rico, because if it rains a little bit, the system is so bad that it's just really easily for lights to go out. And it's like me doing like a deconstructed landscape. And then I wanted to contrast that with the video itself that I was developing, and this idea of like, again, like kind of like creating an umbilical cord between this kind of like digital culture and then kind of like the physical landscape, and kind of like to open up that space, that syntax, and how they overlap or don't overlap with each other. But yeah, like usually I sometimes I've become more of a purist, especially in 2000, I guess since 2018, about like doing work and concentrating on things instead of like being baroque and having a million things and being like really like elusive about the work or like about the meaning. So these days I just really try to tighten it up and not try to mix a lot of video with sculpture, or sometimes I do. I think I'm trying to get loose again. At one moment I was trying to go back into foundationals. This is La Colonia. La Colonia is basically I take sugarcane and I turn it into ant farms. So there's all live ants living in there, and the ants are like Western harvest ants, and it's kind of like funny. Like it's obviously what I'm doing. It's pretty obvious what I'm spinning there.
What is it like to work with living like ants or plant, water? Like, are there like all these like unexpected? Have you ever shown this in a gallery? Like someone has to be like, well, I have to go water the ant.
No, I haven't shown it. It was like this was like the transition between me going into ICP in 2019, 2020 had the show with Vika, and then the whole world started ending. So it was like this weird thing, like, oh, this is what I was working on. I was actually redoing them right now, and I think you saw one maybe when you went into the studio. I don't remember.
Yeah.
And trying to, because the whole plan was like try make these colonies and then have drawings like architectural sketches and kind of like this modernist architectural thinking process of like how to create modernist architecture for the ants. So it was like a back and forth between kind of like, oh yeah, how do you treat the ants as, you know, kind of like responsibly as having a symbiotic relationship with us, and like me having an ethical responsibility to them. So in that case, I try to be as ethical as possible. I'm like a Donna Haraway kind of guy, and kind of like being like, okay, what's the conversation I'm having with the ants? How do I put myself in their position? Is the sugarcane wet enough? Are they suffering? How many holes do I need? Sometimes I need to add some space gel, which serves as food and water if the sugarcane is still a little bit too dry and I want to do something with it. So it becomes like it's a whole conversation, and you develop patience, and you know, but I think that's what makes art interesting, right? Going into these weird spaces and asking these questions that unexpectedly you weren't expecting to ask yourself. So yeah, patient.
Yeah. Oh wait, and before I forget, can we talk about the title of this Precog time? Media means sock. in Spanish.
You
Like,
want
yeah, what are you telling us with this?
I'm literally not telling you anything from it.
Anything.
asked me
Okay,
for-
we're like, is it about misdirection? Is it about, mistranslation?
It's about me being extremely literal because media means suck. Media means suck in Spanish. There's no secret, a secret going into it. I guess if I could give it a spin right now, I would say like, media is everything. I read myself into the school of thought in media studies. What's his name? Durham Peters. And this idea of like, he had a book called This Marvelous Class, which I think around 2019, it was like really impactful or created a nice feedback loop within my thinking process and my working process. And this idea of like looking at clouds as medium, which is like what Heidegger did after a while. And how do you read everything as medium? For example, how whales use water as medium itself. So in a lot of senses, I can make that a stretch and be like, well, we talk about media in this way of like, oh, like, legacy media and social media and the whatnot, but in the most expansive sense, anything that carries a message and could be datified or codified, then can carry a message. So a sock can also be media as media.
What was the name of the book? The Marvelous Club?
This Marvelous Class, I'll put it on the chat.
Okay.
Yes, I really, really gave it the marvelous class towards the philosophy of elemental media. Okay. John Durham Peters. So everyone should. It's like a really, really good book. It talks a lot about whales communicating with each other and kind of like, or at one moment in the beginning of the book, he talks about that, and then this idea of like the sense of time, because obviously it takes some time to travel on what is the sense of time that whales may have in longing and so on. I think it's really interesting putting ourselves in that mindset. It's almost like, someone that also I think about, especially as I went into the more, I guess, the media work that happened during the pandemic, which is the exhibition that I have right now at ICP, thinking about Willem Flusser. I don't know if you guys know the theoretician, kind of like media theoretician, and one of the things that inspired the recent work was him just talking a lot, him and McLuhan and some other theoreticians about, and Kittler, about how linear language and this idea of the written language is just so anachronistic and it's basically dead. And then what does it mean for the future of communication? Images, the web culture, how we interface with memetics, and so on and so on. Media studies.
Can you put that one in the chat too?
Yeah.
In the chat. Yeah, because I was thinking, I feel like there's a lot of conversation about space when you think about digital, but not a lot of people don't really talk about coding or language as much, like the more, I don't know, typical user. And I was wondering how the history of language informs some of your work.
Yeah, I think I at one moment I used to write a lot, and then I was like, you know what, this is like, and I've said this phrase too much. I'm gonna not try to say it again in any of these talks about words and language being the oldest ready-mades. And this idea, like, we have these words from like the 18th, 17th, 14th century, and we're still reusing them and the same structures, meaning the same like temporal tenses, and we're still basing our whole interaction or whole social contrast about this language, that all of the tools in society have changed except language. And it's great. It's a nice cartography. It kind of grounds us. We have all of this legacy, all of these bullshit books that, oh, look at us. We have a cultural genealogy and we're this species. But at the same time, it's kind of like, wow, look at us still using the same words from that Shakespeare came up with, in this case in the English language one, and we're kind of like stuck there. And in a lot of senses, that goes into this idea of like linearity. And when it comes into computer interfaces and whatnot, it's kind of like, well, it's interesting drawing that line between language and the original tablets, like cuneiform and so on. And this kind of idea And again, like, I don't know how deep we want to take this deep dive into like cuneiform and symbols and hierarchies and agrologistics and structures of power. But again, yeah, like it's funny how, again, flat surfaces make a symbol, written information. Everything has changed, and now we have the same words over and over again. And then it raises the question, like, how adaptable is that same language? Are we shortening ourselves up from certain other possibilities about our social contrast, or how can we relate to each other? What we can create, like, for example, as designers or in the art field and the whatnot. So again, those questions arise without going too much into the deep end of it. Yes. Well, that was like a nice backtrack. Usually we just go, blah. Okay, go ahead, guys. Next question.
Oh, I mean, it's sort of we've gotten to like the sort of propositional questions part of the evening, but it's interesting because that you know, like Flusser is a really interesting thinker. And I guess like in my memory of this text on like photography and the image, which I just dropped the title of in the chat, it's like the Tour de Philosophy of Photography, right? Where he's talking about the relationship between, basically he sort of proposes that like for a while, text and image had this dependent relationship on one another, where like text writing was used to elaborate an image, and images were sort of held the function of a text, which then later necessitated more words in order to try to understand them. And that photography interrupted this process between people making language and people making paintings or something like this, or people making objects, because the photograph became like a word, right? It became a ready-made in the same way that you talked about language becoming a ready-made. And he then ends up sort of like the Flusser enthusiasts who are like, Flusser like precipitated the internet or whatever, right? Is like he then talks about how this element of the photograph and its mechanism, right? The mechanism which produces this word, which is the photograph, ends up meaning that this traditional relationship between the word and the made image is now defunct. And we have to think about processes which create image words and the networks which contain them in relationship to one another, which sort of then, just as a, anyway, as far as I understand it, but like, which then loops us back to, I think, Flo's one of the earlier questions that you were talking about, which is how some of a lot of your work, especially the videos, ends up taking on the function of collage. But it's a really particular kind of collage, because what you're collaging together are not just, you know, the visual ready-mades, right, and the aural ready-mades, like these sounds that we've talked about, but also these kinds of processes or gestures. And I was just also interested in the idea, you know, the way that Flusser will sometimes talk about gestures as kind of emotional ready-mades, right? We like understand a frown, or we understand someone crying in this way, which is also linguistic. And to this extent, and again, I know this is another long question, but because you seem to be so interested in the economic and political dynamics, I think probably in a much more wide-ranging way than you've talked about here, but in particular in your later work between, you know, like the continued colonial effects of Puerto Rico, as well as the way that it lines up to other like modes of like runaway exploitative and extractive processes, right? Whether that's memes and like political manipulation, or blockchain and like this kind of sort of like, you know, speculative money making run amok. I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk a little bit further about the way that you, and again, maybe this is like a rephrasing of Flo's earlier question, but like how it is that you're interested in bringing the things together that you bring together, and maybe like what maybe the mode of political or, you know, aesthetic political engagement that you're hoping to get at in the work.
I just try to be tapping to my reality. Like, to be completely honest, there's no overarching ideological thing. For example, when I did the video of like we saw a clip of it was just like me seeing disconnections, being interested. I went to the effort to go into Puerto Rico. I embedded myself within the groups and was part. So all of the things that you see at the end of that video were actually the private chats of Brock Pierce and all this group of crypto experts and whatnot. So I tried dealing with a lot with, again, like I'm sourcing media from these three nodes and dealing with the facts as facts and not creating allegories of it and trying to represent like a complicated landscape without almost, I'm making obviously a kind of like joke on Trump, like and water dripping out of his mouth and whatnot and blah blah blah. But I try not to, I try to take a complicated view and perspective of the issues and be kind of like, okay, this is weird. Like try to keep it at a kind of like yeah. So I try not to, and this is me avoiding the ethical conundrums of being an artist doing political or quasi-political work, but I want to point out more about the complexities of the issues, and that points again to this idea of like language, how we relate to it. For example, one of the things that I always talk in Puerto Rico or with my political friends, like most of them are not in Puerto Rico, they're in the diaspora. When the issue comes up, I try to talk about the complexity of like, we import all of these ideologies, like what it means to be a colony, what it means to be independent from obviously European cultures from a really specific time in the world. And maybe it's time to reset or define our own word for what we should become. I believe in an association of the Antilles. So all of the islands uniting. We're not South American, we're not North American. So how do you come to your own terms and define your own political reality or your ecological reality vis-a-vis the language from the old world? And that's where it becomes like this kind of idea taken, like thinking about language as technology, about, I always like the story of like Europeans coming to the Americas for the first time and then being like, what the fuck are this shit hurricanes? Like, what, this is crazy. And they kind of like having to adapt the word hurricane from the natives in the Caribbean to kind of like, oh, these are this massive, crazy ass storms that happen over here. That's insane. And then have so a lot of like kind of like the season 1, episode 2 and 3 was I guess diving into that. But again, just thinking about this idea of like how I approach all of these issues is kind of like me pointing about the conundrums, the contradictions, the complexities. For example, I can talk a lot shit about the United States being a colonial status, but at the end of the day, my mom was born and raised in Chicago. My grandma had her own, so there are like these complexities that are inherent that it would be a hypocrisy for me to talk about this stuff. Yes, it's exploitative and we gotta change this relationship, but then how do you reframe that? How do you actually talk about it in a clear way, and so on 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 and so on. Backtrack from the deep end, go ahead.
If anyone has any questions, now is a great time to drop them in the chat. And just sort of like, it just strikes me that like one of the ways, one of the things that you try to get at, I think in many ways, is trying to make clear this lack of clarity. Like, and there's no way to make something which is unclear and misdirected clear. You can only clearly show the misdirection.
Yeah.
As opposed to like pretending that it's as like shiny and intelligible as the ads that you would be given in a certain place.
Well, I guess that's the good thing, or like the interesting thing about art as a space of inquiry, of allowing you to work with all of these materials, all of these sources, and kind of like frame these things in a certain way that are not necessarily that go beyond language in a lot of senses, and kind of like, oh, this is it, this is that, and so on and so on. So having this space, and I talk a lot about shit about the art world, I guess, but I defend it like vehemently when I'm in this kind of conversation. Yeah, like the space to do this weird stuff, which is like almost like I even struggle sometimes to explain what I'm doing. Like, as I've been saying, like language fails me, or words fail me, which is a quote by somebody else. I don't remember who. But yeah, kind of like I think it's important to have these spaces that will allow for a certain kind of new exploration of syntax and semiotics, especially in this new realities that we're living in relation to media and how that media obviously overlaps with politics. Being over here, being in the Caribbean, being someplace else around the world, and so on and so on and so on. That's the latest video that I'm working on, which is we didn't see a preview, but it's like a all Instagram ads. It's like a pretty fun, intense. I don't even know if you can stream that over here. Probably the stream will probably slow it down considerably. But I have a show. I should plug the show at ICP right now. Hey yo, the show is titled Zero Zero. I gotta put it because again, language. Zero. It's at the ground floor gallery, and it's up until February 25. And we didn't get to talk about this work, but it's all if you follow my Instagram or going to my Instagram, which is at you'll see a bunch of them. It's all videos that I made on my iPhone throughout the duration of the pandemic, and they all last like 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, or 2.5 second loops. They are not longer than 3 seconds. But it's like a fun little exhibition, interactive media player that I created for the gallery. So if anyone's bored or interested, feel free to go ahead and knock on my door when over there.
Susan Hapgood wants to know if there's humor intended in your work and how you're thinking about engaging the audience.
You know, there's a great tradition in Hispanic art, and it's almost like Zen, like tragicomedia, tragic comedy. And this kind of idea of like, you know, I think about Giuseppe Rivera and this kind of baroque painters of like having a guitar player in the darkness, and this kind of idea of like, oh, kind of like having humor to put you in a, to kind of like lower your defenses and then hit you with something heavy. But it's really about mixing like light and darkness, and like that's what life is about at the end of the day. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, definitely humor, definitely light, definitely hope, definitely dark cynicism, definitely there's a song by Silvio Rodriguez that says like más de una vez, it's basically saying like more than one time I've been drinking at the chapel and stuff like that. And it's kind of like those kind of contradictions that make undefined life as a total picture. I definitely embrace like the right tone for me. Any other questions?
I feel like you should mention or talk about how you install the video work, because it's very particular. There's like your projector is hanging from the ceiling on this like chain, and then everything's kind of suspended, and the videos activate when you walk in and change when you move out, you know?
Yes. Maybe you can put the visual that I think I sent you guys a visual, right? Oh, this, okay. So you see our fearless leader, Susan Hapgood there, that just got the question in the inside of the installation space. So it's really simple. I just wanted to do a basically have an empty gallery. How much to talk about this with, I usually try to embed a lot of art references in my work, like, and kind of like this kind of like subtle allusions without me having to blah on them. But to simplify this, I guess I just wanted to have an interactive media player that what happens is every time you enter the gallery, the motion detector goes off and it gets at random a video from this pool that's right now, the ones that are over, right now the videos are more than 150. I have like 135, between 135 and 145 over there in the gallery. And what happens is when it detects a movement, the media player gets a video at random and just loops it until the library, until the gallery goes empty again. Why I did it that way is because I didn't want anything on the floor. And then I wanted to have a soft floor, and thinking about this, all of the videos are mostly like social media content or like just online detritus. So I like this idea of like, it's like really like the internet, kind of like it feels soft and safe, but at the same time, there's like a hanging pending danger coming from the top. And I just wanted that tension between things that seem heavy floating that they may fall on you, and then have this full soft gene floor underneath it, and have this space where you actually become bodily aware. And the videos are really like kind of like, you know, you feel I mean, at least for me, I feel like the videos are like make you aware of your body, and people have told me as much. And for me, it's kind of like this weird space of like digital awareness of my presence and creating and playing around with that tension. We.
Manal, oh, go
Yeah.
ahead, Flo.
Yeah, you can do it.
Oh, Manal wanted to ask more specifically about translation in relation to both language and media across platform spaces, landscapes, architecture, etc. And so, like, how do you engage translation if you do? And yeah, that's it.
When I was studying, when I was in grade school, my teacher told me never to translate poetry, and that's basically my relation to translation. It's always kind of like tricky because if I don't know, if I'm like, applying for something in Spanish language, I always like hesitate to even translate in the test because it's kind of like really specific. So even like with titles, sometimes I do like Las Colonias, the colonies. I think translation is tricky, a lot of gaping holes, especially when you mix more than 2 words or 3 words. It just becomes something else completely. And obviously, as any literary person would know, the good translator will actually rewrite the book to get a sense of like what it is and not do a literal translation. So I don't know how that translates into media and the one. I think it will be interesting. Uh, Again, going to this works in the exhibition, I had a little bit like last year with Margot Norton, and she mentioned like the works themselves like work like micro essays, and this idea of like overlapping text, language, and the whatnot. I think that's really interesting. And I guess that's what I would point out too, of like how do you translate those works in the future? Are they translatable or not into actual same like kind of like written language or like this kind of like a specific kind of symbols? I don't know. I think so this I don't know how to rate it. Something that I think about these days is like Elon Musk when he was doing the annoying thing with the pigs doing the Neuralink demonstration. He was like, in the future, when we have Neuralink, we're not gonna use what was it? We're not gonna use words to communicate. And as someone that studies philosophy and the empirics, and like, so if I want to talk to someone about a table, will I send them the image of the table? Will I send them the concept of a table with a 4 legs and a flat surface? Would I think about a specific table and so on? So it's like really interesting to think about this concept. And I think that's why it's really interesting also doing this kind of work of like addressing these questions and so on. And some other projects that I'm doing right now, and kind of like being more aggressive in the art field, I guess, into just dabbing and posting this big question statement. What is your relationship with media, with attention spans, with how we relate to language, with how that relates to nationalism, how that's been disrupted, and so on and so on and so on.
It reminds me of again, I know it seems like maybe the best way to have a conversation with you is to keep asking the same questions at different points, right? It seems to like go along with the concept, right? But that then this issue of media being sock in Spanish, where your first answer was that you're being overly literal, right? The second answer has to do with the impossibility of translation, right? There is no world that means media in English and like media and socks in Spanish. Anyway, that's funny. That's another good joke, right? It's like to be like, how are these things that we use to facilitate movement actually just obstacles to communication?
Right. Media are fun. Media are funny. Socks are funny. Medias are funny. Point being, it's really interesting because why do we have socks? Why do we have socks and shoes? Can we just do a combination and just work them out together forever? So, yeah. Any other questions?
Come on, it's your chance to ask a question.
You will never get me in a more sincere way. Media as half. How deep can we go down this rabbit hole? Yes, like the middle point between transmission between two nodes of a message. Yes, it's really important. And also the sock is the media and the middle between the shoe and the foot. There you Okay, we're going down the rabbit hole right now.
I think we should end. I think this is
Had it.
time. I think if yeah, I guess we can end the formal Precog time for now, right? We're good. We have an hour.
Go to Carlos's show before it comes down in the next, what is it, February 10th?
February 25.
February 25.
Yes.
And yeah, and then Carlos and I are gonna be chatting on the ISCP Instagram on Thursday at 5.
Yes, Thursday at 5. Be present. We'll talk about socks and shoes
Well, yeah,
and the
we're gonna
future
just
of
keep talking about the socks thing.
about Yeezys. Yes.
Maybe like the pigs, like the telepathic pigs too.
Holy
I'm
shit.
gonna have
Yeah.
to do research and see what's going on with that.